With the sudden spike in states who have legalized medical and recreational marijuana use, the average U.S. citizen may be confused on the situation. You may ask, why now? Isn't marijuana a bad thing? Why is it illegal in the first place? Why should I care? Well, you are in luck because in today's video I will discuss the origins of marijuana in the United States, as well as primary politicians, legislation, movements, and the current state of marijuana in the United States. Marijuana usage first became popular in the early 20th century during alcohol prohibition. It is said that Mexican immigrants first showed Americans the idea of smoking cannabis during this time, and marijuana use became very popular and stayed popular amongst Mexican Americans and African Americans, and in jazz clubs in the 1920s. Harry J. Anslinger was appointed the first commissioner of the U.S. Treasury Department's Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930 and served until 1962. Anslinger is an important figure in the short history of marijuana in the U.S. because of his role on this newly formed committee. Anslinger is known for having two stances on the legalization of marijuana. First being that it is dangerous and causes users to become insane, and second that it is a tool used by minorities to forget their social standing. I have included a couple of quotes from Anslinger here for you. The first of the quotes is, "Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death." The second of the quotes is this, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others." Anslinger fought against what he called the evil weed, and in conjunction with propaganda such as the 1936 film Reefer Madness, turned the public against marijuana. In turn, in 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which criminalized marijuana for the first time and restricted possession of the drug to those who paid an excise tax to do so. However, Anslinger did not go about his business without doubters and opponents. The most famous of his doubters was New York Mayor Fiorello Laguardia, who argued that the drug was being incorrectly portrayed and that prohibition could never be enforced. LaGuardia appointed a committee of scientists to study marijuana in 1944, and the results were published. The conclusions from the study showed that marijuana did not cause addiction, other drug abuse, or crime, but the study did not have the impact that he had hoped. Fast forward to the 1950s, and the U.S. passes two new pieces of legislation, the Boggs Act of 1952 and the Narcotics Control Act of 1956, which together help set mandatory sentences for several drug-related offenses, including marijuana-related offenses. In the 1960s and 70s, marijuana was a popular symbol in counterculture and was closely related to the anti-war peace movements of the time period. In 1971, President Richard Nixon gave a speech in which he called drug abuse America's public enemy number one, and officially launched his War on Drugs campaign to fight drug abuse in the United States. In a 1994 interview with Harper's Magazine, John Ehrlichman, President Nixon's former advisor on domestic affairs, was asked about the war on drugs and gave this answer. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Then, in 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. The act effectively raised fines and prison sentences for possession and dealing of marijuana. Then, in a 1988 campaign speech, presidential candidate George H.W. Bush alluded to his own future policy for marijuana when he called for the continuance of the war on drugs on all fronts. He went on to say, "Legalization is just another word for surrender, and surrender is not in our vocabulary. While in office, Mr. Bush increased spending for the war on drugs greatly, with education and enforcement being his top priorities. In the 1996 election, California effectively surrendered, at least by Bush's definition, and passed Proposition 215, which legalized medical marijuana in the state. Since that moment, 32 other states have legalized medical marijuana, and 10 states, including California, have legalized recreational use of marijuana. The most recent legislation was passed in our 2018 midterm elections, where Michigan legalized recreational marijuana and Utah and Missouri both legalized medical marijuana. Legalization was also on the ballot in North Dakota, but failed to be passed. The states that have voted to legalize marijuana have become examples of how it could impact other states and their economies. With legal marijuana dispensaries popping up in these states and high tax rates, states have brought in lots of tax revenue from the sales of marijuana. For example, the first state to legalize recreational marijuana was Colorado in 2014, and from then up to May 31st of 2018, marijuana sales generated $506 million in tax revenue.